Imagine for a moment that you wield nearly unlimited power, command vast armies, and hold in your hands the key to conquering all of Middle-earth. You are Sauron, the Dark Lord, and you believe you have calculated every move your enemies could make. But what if I told you that even as one of the most powerful beings in Tolkien's creation, you made crucial mistakes that sealed your fate? Today, we're diving into the dark mind of Sauron to discover how he truly perceived the War of the Ring. Get ready for a unique journey through the most epic saga in fantasy, but this time, through the eyes of the villain. We'll uncover his darkest secrets, military strategies, and political calculations that shaped every decision in The Lord of the Rings. Are you ready to see the story from the perspective of the one who almost won everything, but lost because of details he never imagined? Are you ready for a revelation that will completely transform the way you see The Lord of the Rings? Because what you'll discover in the next few minutes goes far beyond what you've seen in Peter Jackson's films or even in Tolkien's epic books. We're talking about an entirely new perspective, one that only the most devoted fans of Middle-earth truly know. I'll show you exactly how Sauron, the most cunning, corrupted Maya in the creation of Eru Ilúvatar, saw every piece on the grand chessboard of the War of the Ring. This isn't just speculation, but concrete evidence hidden within Tolkien's own writings that reveal the true strategic genius of the Dark Lord. Prepare to discover 3 hidden evidences that explain how he calculated, almost mathematically, every move of Aragorn, Gandalf, and even the little hobbits who carried his precious ring. But here's what will really shock you. There was one detail, a single variable in his 1,000-year plan that Sauron never foresaw. And if you are someone who truly appreciates the depth of Tolkien's legendarium, you need to understand exactly how the mind of one of Arda's most intelligent beings worked during his most critical moments. Because once you understand Sauron's perspective, the entire saga takes on new layers of meaning that will make you rethink every battle, every strategy, and every epic moment you thought you already knew. To truly grasp the mind of Sauron, we need to dive into Tolkien's original texts, especially the Silmarillion and the letters the professor himself wrote, explaining the deeper motivations of his characters. And here is the first devastating evidence that changes how we see the entire War of the Ring. Sauron was not just a megalomaniacal tyrant driven by thirst for power. He was a Maya, an angelic being, corrupted, but still possessing a comprehension of creation far beyond any mortal in Middle-earth. And this superior understanding gave him an almost mathematical confidence in his victory. In Tolkien's writings, we discover that Sauron built his strategy on a principle he considered infallible. No mortal being, no matter how brave or noble, would ever dare to wield the One Ring against its true master. For Sauron, this was not arrogance, it was pure logic. He knew the ring's corrupting power better than anyone in Arda. He had witnessed mighty kings, wise wizards, and legendary warriors fall to its seductive call. Isildur himself, the man who had the chance to destroy it, could not resist. So how could a simple hobbit from the Shire, a creature Sauron considered beneath even ordinary men, possibly succeed where kings and heroes had failed? And it is here that we find one of the most revealing moments of the entire saga. When Frodo, at Mount Doom, claims the ring for himself and declares he is the new Lord of the Ring, Sauron experiences something he had not felt in millennia: pure terror and utter confusion. To his strategic mind, only a being with power to rival his own would dare such a declaration. In his logic, Frodo had become impossibly a rival capable of challenging him directly. But here lies the detail that few ever notice, and that reveals Tolkien's narrative genius. Throughout the entire War of the Ring, Sauron never once considered Frodo a real threat. To him, the Hobbit was nothing more than an insignificant shadow on his vast strategic map. In his calculating mind, Frodo was merely a pawn, moved by greater forces, likely Gandalf or Aragorn, his true worthy opponents. This misperception is fundamental to understanding how Sauron interpreted every move of the war unfolding before him. And this brings us directly to the second crucial evidence that reshapes our entire view of the Dark Lord's power and limitations. Here, we must make a fundamental distinction between what Peter Jackson showed us on screen and what Tolkien actually wrote, because this difference reveals essential aspects of Sauron's psychology that many fans overlook. In Jackson's films, Sauron is portrayed as a blazing, ever-watchful eye, an omnipresent consciousness that seems to see across all of Middle-earth, instantly aware of every move his enemies make. This visual interpretation, though cinematically striking, creates the image of an almost omniscient villain, one who appears to control everything unfolding around him. But in Tolkien's original texts, we discover something far more fascinating and far more complex. Sauron did not possess this cinematic omniscience. Instead, the professor describes a projected spiritual consciousness, a psychic force that extended primarily over Mordor and through his armies, servants, and the creatures bound to his will. This distinction is absolutely crucial to understanding how Sauron's strategic mind truly operated during the War of the Ring. Now imagine the practical difference between being truly omniscient and being immensely powerful, yet still limited by one's own nature. Sauron functioned as a master strategist, gathering intelligence through a vast network of spies, servants, corrupted creatures, and his own expanded spiritual perception. He interpreted signals, analyzed troop movements, and decoded the intentions of his enemies based on patterns of behavior and military intelligence. And here is where his brilliance met his greatest weakness. Sauron was extraordinarily skilled at interpreting these signs, but like any strategist, no matter how brilliant, he was still subject to misinterpreting the information he received. His conclusions, though grounded in superior logic and millennia of experience, depended on the quality and accuracy of the data reaching him. This interpretive vulnerability leads us directly to the third and most fascinating piece of evidence, which reveals how Sauron's very genius became his most sophisticated trap. To truly grasp this complex mechanism of Tolkien's lore, we must dive into the technical aspects of how the Dark Lord's power actually worked, because here we find one of the most brilliant paradoxes ever written in fantasy literature. Sauron built his empire of intelligence on three fundamental pillars that he considered infallible. First, the Palantiri, the seeing stones crafted by the Noldor in Valinor, which allowed long-distance communication and observation across Middle-earth. Through these stones he could influence minds, manipulate information, and coordinate his forces with precision his enemies could never match. Second, the Nazgul, his most feared servants, once mighty kings corrupted by the Nine Rings, who served as direct extensions of his will and perception. They could track the One Ring through spiritual bonds that transcended physical limits. But the third pillar was the most crucial, and ironically the most treacherous, his intimate and indissoluble bond with the One Ring, his most precious creation, into which he had poured the greatest part of his power and spiritual essence. This connection was not merely strategic or sentimental, it was existential. Sauron had forged so much of himself into the ring that his very survival depended on that seemingly simple band of gold. And here we uncover the cruel irony of his fate. As the One Ring drew closer to Mordor during Frodo and Sam's journey, Sauron experienced a swelling sense of euphoria and confidence. To his strategic mind, every mile the ring traveled toward his realm was proof that his grand plan was working flawlessly. He interpreted its approach as irrefutable evidence that the ring was finally returning to its rightful master, fulfilling its inevitable destiny. The spiritual connection between Sauron and his creation functioned like a feedback loop, exponentially feeding his confidence. The closer the ring came to Mount Doom, the stronger Sauron felt, the clearer his perception seemed, and the more convinced he became that he had outmaneuvered his enemies. To his logic, this growing closeness could mean only one thing: imminent victory and the recovery of his most precious treasure. But here lies the cruelest and most brilliant paradox Tolkien ever devised. The same mystical bond that gave Sauron insight into the ring's location and amplified his power also created a devastating blind spot in his perception. Sauron was so consumed by the euphoria of feeling his ring return that he utterly failed to consider the simplest, most devastating possibility: that someone might be carrying his creation not to return it to him, but to destroy it forever. The bond that should have been his greatest strength had become his fatal weakness, blinding him at the very moment he needed clarity most. And now, To truly comprehend the magnitude of this miscalculation, we must do something few have ever dared. Step inside the mind of Sauron during the final moments of the War of the Ring. We must experience the events through his own psychological perspective, his interpretations, his certainties, and the precise instant when his millennia of logic collapsed completely. Imagine for a moment that you are Sauron, witnessing the unfolding of the war's climax through your own spiritual eyes. You watch flames engulf Minas Tirith, the white city of Gondor, and a deep satisfaction fills your ancient consciousness. The armies of men falter before the overwhelming might of your orcs, trolls, and Nazgul. Terror spreads among the free peoples of Middle-earth like an unstoppable plague. Every scream of despair, every crumbling wall, every fallen warrior confirms what you have always known. Your supremacy is absolute, undeniable. But then something strange begins to unfold on the great strategic board. You notice military movements that at first seem confused, almost desperate. Aragorn, this so-called King of Gondor, marches with a laughably small army toward the Black Gate of Mordor. What kind of suicidal strategy is this? In your calculating mind, the answer emerges with crystalline clarity. They are not coming to destroy you, they are coming to distract you. Of course, they know they cannot win by force, so they attempt a desperate diversion, perhaps to buy time, perhaps for some secondary plan that your superior intelligence has already anticipated and neutralized. You, Sauron, the oldest and wisest of the Maiar, the forger of the One Ring, the conqueror of kingdoms, know that this pitiful display of mortal courage is nothing more than the final gasp of a doomed resistance. Your victory is not merely likely, it is mathematically certain. Every piece of the puzzle falls neatly into place within your millennia-old strategy. The ring is drawing closer. You can feel it pulsing stronger with every passing moment, your connection with it intensifying like never before. Soon, your most precious creation will return to your hand, and your dominion over Middle-earth will be complete and unshakable. But then something happens that shatters the very foundations of your reality. In that crucial instant, when everything seemed to march inevitably toward your triumph, the One Ring is claimed. But not by Aragorn, not by Gandalf, not by any of the powerful adversaries you had identified as potential threats. The claim comes from a source so improbable, so absurd within your strategic logic, that for a moment your ancient mind simply cannot process the information. In that instant of absolute shock, a devastating realization pierces your consciousness like lightning. It was never the military strength of men that truly challenged you, never the swords of Gondor or the magic of Gandalf that posed the real danger. It was something you had never considered worthy of your attention, the inexplicable audacity of a heart you had utterly underestimated, the reckless courage of a creature so small and seemingly insignificant that it had never once appeared in your strategic calculations as a relevant variable. And in that moment of total revelation, when the truth of what was happening finally breaks into your millennia-old consciousness, you understand the true magnitude of your fundamental error. For ages uncounted, you had built your entire strategy on a single premise, that all beings, without exception, ultimately desired power. This was the logic that governed your existence, the driving force behind every decision since your corruption. How could a mind as ancient and wise as yours ever conceive that someone might willingly renounce supreme power? But here we must pause to address a long-standing debate among Tolkien scholars. Some argue that our interpretation of Sauron's blindness is exaggerated, that the Dark Lord may actually have had more awareness of Frodo's presence in Mordor than is often assumed. And this critique deserves serious consideration, for there are textual hints suggesting a more subtle perception on Sauron's part. Indeed, if we examine the original texts carefully, we find moments where Tolkien implies that Sauron sensed something, a disturbance in the shadows of his own land, a strange presence walking the desolate paths of Mordor. There are indications that his expanded spiritual awareness detected anomalies, small dissonances in the dark harmony of his domain. Some Tolkien scholars interpret these passages as evidence that Sauron knew at some subconscious level that something significant was happening right under his nose. This perspective raises fascinating questions about the exact nature of Sauron's perception and forces us to re-examine our understanding of his limitations. If he did indeed sense Frodo, then his failure becomes even more complex and psychologically compelling. It would not merely be a matter of sensory limitation or reach of power, but here lies the crucial point Tolkien himself clarified in his letters and supplemental writings. Sauron's true failure was not one of magical perception or spiritual awareness, it was a failure of imagination. Even if he sensed something amiss, even if his consciousness picked up signals of an unauthorized presence in his land, he simply could not mentally process the possibility that someone might be attempting to destroy the very object of supreme power. This imaginative limitation reveals something profound about Tolkien's psychology of corruption. Sauron had become so consumed by his lust for dominion, so defined by his will to control, that he completely lost the ability to understand motives not centered on power. To a mind corrupted by millennia of ambition, the concept of willingly renouncing ultimate power had become literally unthinkable. This inability to conceive of power's self-destruction exposes one of the deepest limitations that corruption can impose on even the most brilliant mind. Sauron had become a prisoner of his own nature, incapable of thinking outside the patterns he had long assumed to be universal. It was as if his ages of striving for domination had created a kind of psychological blindness, preventing him from recognizing any motivation that was not a mirror of his own shadowed essence. And it is precisely here that we arrive at the emotional heart of this entire analysis, the moment when Tolkien's narrative genius reveals its most profound and transformative dimension. Because what we are uncovering is not just a strategic flaw or a tactical limitation in a fictional villain. We are facing a universal lesson about human nature, about how evil operates in our own lives, about the psychological mechanisms that make us vulnerable to corruption or equip us for heroic resistance. The final downfall of Sauron transcends the realm of military or strategic defeat. He was not overthrown by superior armies, by greater magic, or by more sophisticated tactics. His defeat was fundamentally moral, a devastating demonstration of how the corruption of character can blind even the brightest minds to the most basic realities of the human condition. Sauron lost because he projected his own corrupted nature onto all others, assuming that every being shared his insatiable thirst for domination and control. Evil, in its purest and most concentrated form, always commits this fundamental error. It believes that all hearts are ruled by the same dark impulses, that every decision is driven by ambition, that every intelligent being will inevitably grasp for power when the chance is given. For Sauron, it was inconceivable that anyone might genuinely choose renunciation instead of domination, sacrifice instead of self-gain, the voluntary destruction of power instead of its accumulation. But Frodo, Sam, and even the tragic Gollum proved otherwise, in ways that shook the very foundations of Sauron's logic. Each of them, in their own unique and complex way, demonstrated that genuine free will can transcend even the most sophisticated calculations rooted solely in self-interest. Frodo carried a burden that could destroy him, not for ambition, but out of compassion for the free peoples of Middle-earth. Sam followed his friend into the very heart of Mordor, not for glory or reward, but out of pure loyalty and fraternal love. And even Gollum, in his corrupted and pitiful form, ultimately served a purpose greater than his own petty obsessions. His dual nature, torn between Sméagol and Gollum, between lingering humanity and total corruption, introduced an element of unpredictability that not even Sauron's most intricate calculations could fully anticipate. This is the true genius of Tolkien's narrative. It shows us that genuine compassion, selfless love, and moral courage can systematically overcome fear, manipulation, and domination, not through superior power, but through motives that transcend the very logic of power itself. This lesson extends far beyond the fantastical world of Middle-earth and confronts us with profound truths about our own reality. How often in our own lives do we assume that those around us are motivated by the same ambitions that drive us? How often do we fail to recognize genuine acts of kindness because our minds are conditioned to look for hidden agendas, for personal gain, for selfish motives behind every gesture? Sauron represents this human tendency taken to its absolute extreme, the inability to recognize authentic morality when it appears in its purest form. He had become so consumed by his manipulative nature that he completely lost the ability to acknowledge truly selfless motives. To his corrupted mind, every act of kindness must conceal a secret agenda. Every sacrifice must mask a search for future advantage. Every gesture of compassion must be a disguised strategy. But the hobbits, especially Frodo and Sam, operated on a moral plane that simply did not exist within Sauron's conceptual framework. They were not seeking to conquer the world, nor dreaming of ruling vast territories, nor lusting after supreme power over others. Their motives were at once simpler and deeper: to protect what they loved, to preserve the peace of their small corner of the world, to ensure that future generations could live free. And here we reach the most striking revelation of our entire analysis. Evil systematically fails because it fundamentally cannot comprehend the devastating simplicity of authentic courage. We are not talking about the spectacular bravery of the battlefield, the cinematic heroism that wins kingdoms and slays dragons. We are talking about the quiet, stubborn courage of continuing to walk when every step is agony, of carrying an impossible burden because someone must carry it, of choosing to do what is right even when the personal cost is unbearable. That moral simplicity is exactly what corrupted, overcomplicated minds like Sauron's cannot process. They search for layers of strategy where there is only sincerity. They seek elaborate conspiracies where there is only genuine love. They try to decode sophisticated schemes where there is only the basic, unwavering decision to do good, regardless of the consequences. And since we're uncovering hidden secrets of Tolkien's legendarium, I can't resist sharing one last observation that may make you rethink some of the saga's most epic moments. Considering elvish millennia-old wisdom and the heightened perception that defines their race, it is highly likely that Legolas understood far more about the true purpose of the Fellowship's mission than he ever revealed explicitly. Think of the natural intelligence of the elves, their ability to perceive nuances invisible to other peoples of Middle-earth, their intuitive grasp of the flows of power that run through the world. Legolas was not just a skilled warrior or an exceptional archer. He was an elven prince with ancestral wisdom flowing through his veins. It's almost impossible to imagine that such a refined mind did not connect the dots between Frodo's mysterious presence in the Fellowship, Gandalf's cautious behavior, and the subtle patterns of events unfolding around them. And here is what makes this observation even more fascinating. If Legolas truly understood the nature of the mission from the very beginning, it means he consciously chose to keep the secret, to protect the operation through his own discretion, to contribute to the success of the quest through his silent loyalty. Once again, we see Tolkien's recurring theme. True nobility reveals itself through personal sacrifices made for the greater good, without any need for recognition or public glory. And this reflection brings us back to the central point of our entire journey into Sauron's mind. Evil fails systematically because it cannot comprehend or predict actions rooted in genuine moral principles. Corrupted minds operate only within transactional paradigms, where every action must produce a corresponding advantage, where every decision must yield some form of personal return. They simply lack the conceptual tools to anticipate or to counter deeds driven by pure love, selfless loyalty, or authentic compassion. Now the time has come for you to take a stand in this discussion, one that completely transforms our understanding of the most influential work in fantasy literature. Of the three devastating pieces of evidence we explored today, which one truly changed your perspective on Sauron's psychology and Tolkien's hidden strategic genius? Was it the first evidence, that direct revelation from Tolkien's own writings, showing how Sauron's confidence was rooted in the premise that no mortal would dare to wield the One Ring against its true master? Or perhaps the second evidence, the crucial distinction between Peter Jackson's cinematic interpretation and Tolkien's literary description, revealing that Sauron was not omniscient, but a brilliant strategist nonetheless, limited and vulnerable to misinterpreting his own intelligence network? Or was it the third evidence that struck you most, the complex mechanics of the lore, showing how Sauron's intimate bond with the ring, his greatest source of power, simultaneously created his most fatal blind spot? That elegant paradox, where the very connection meant to guarantee his triumph became the very thing that blinded him to the true threat until it was too late? Drop a comment below and tell us which of these revelations most impacted your understanding of Tolkien's legendarium, because this discussion goes far beyond academic curiosity about a fictional universe. We are exploring universal truths about how power corrupts perception, how intellectual arrogance blinds even the brightest minds, and how moral simplicity can overcome the most sophisticated strategic complexity. And since we're talking about fellowships and companionship, it's time to light the beacons of Gondor here on our channel. If this journey into Sauron's mind expanded your vision of Tolkien's hidden depths, leave a like to strengthen our community of true Middle-earth scholars. Subscribe so you don't miss any of the deep analyses we've prepared on the most fascinating aspects of the legendarium. And share this with your own fellowship, with the friends who truly appreciate intelligent discussions about the classics of fantasy literature, because our journey into the most hidden secrets of Middle-earth is only beginning. And in the next episode, we'll venture into even darker and more psychologically complex territory.